To properly tell the story of the Doolittle Raids, we have to go back to Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, a day which will live in infamy. On this day, the Japanese surprise attacked the American naval base in Honolulu, damaged the majority of America's proudest battleships, cruisers, etc. However, the aircraft carriers were not in Pearl Harbor. So although American naval power was very damaged, it wasn't a coup de grace. Objectively, America was still in the fight, but morale-wise, both its civilian and its military population were very, very defeated. This little country, this little Japan, Nihon, they came across the ocean and blew up our ships. That's a big, big FU to our American morale, our American sense of superiority. Right after Pearl Harbor, our president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he told our military, we better get them back. Let's get Japan back. Return them what they did to us. That is how the Doolittle Raids started the planning.
History in the making at the mysterious Shangri-La. Actually, the United States Navy aircraft carrier Hornet steams westward across the Pacific. The protecting force of cruisers and destroyers, with the hard-hitting Admiral Halsey in command, slams into a gale, determined to reach a position 400 miles from Tokyo, unless intercepted by the enemy. Packed on the afterdeck of the Hornet are 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers. Never before have these huge planes been launched from a carrier. High explosive and demolition bombs are made ready for the destruction of military objectives in Japan.
Let's go over some of the details before the actual raid commenced. Within a month of Pearl Harbor, so January of 1942, we started putting together a plan. The plan would consist of one of our aircraft carriers that, thank goodness, wasn't destroyed in Pearl Harbor, and launching long-range bombers to attack major cities in Japan. Problem was, we didn't really have long-range bombers. Remember, guys, we're not attacking ships like what the Japanese did to us. We are attacking their cities. So we need a different set of bombs, and we need more bombs. So we didn't have bombers that could do that. At least bombers that traditionally came equipped with aircraft carriers. So after some planning, we realized we actually do have bombers that can reach Japan and throw a bunch of bombs down. Except these are not sea-based bombers. These are land bombers. After some planning, taking out a bunch of weight, taking out some non-essential parts of the bombers, they took 16 B-25Bs and decided, okay, we're going to put these bombers that are supposed to take off from airfields, we're going to put them on aircraft carriers and have them fly. But very soon they realized even if these bombers could take off from aircraft carriers, they would never be able to land. So it was essentially a one-way mission. You would have to take off from an aircraft carrier, the USS Hornet, and then blow up those targets, those military, those industrial targets, and then you would have to fly somewhere else and land in an airfield. So after much debate, some people said, let's land in the USSR, but the USSR had a neutrality pact with Japan, so the USSR wouldn't allow it. Well, China's our ally. Let's talk to the Chinese. Let's find some airfields that we could land in China. So that was the plan. On the dusk of April 18th, 1942, we would fly 16 B-25Bs from the USS Hornet. The planes would reach Japan in the middle of the night. According to mission planning, quote, in order to make this plan practical, one plane was to take off ahead of the others, arrive over Tokyo at dusk, and fire the most inflammable part of the city with incendiary bombs. This minimized the overall hazard and assured that the target would be lighted up for following planes. The cities to be bombed included Tokyo, Kobe, Osaka, and Nagoya. And then they'd leave, and by the next day, they would reach China and land safely in the airfields. That was the plan. So why is it called Doolittle Raid, you might ask? Because the person leading this crew of 80 was a guy by the name of James H. Doolittle, Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle. Very early morning, April 18th, the Hornet and its escorting ships had already stumbled on Japanese patrols. According to James Doolittle, the first enemy patrol vessel was detected and avoided at 3:10 a.m. on the morning of April 18th. The Navy task force was endeavoring to avoid a second one sometime after daylight when they were picked up by a third. Although this patrol was sunk, it understood that it got at least one radio message off to shore, and it was consequently necessary for us to take off immediately. According to Admiral Halsey, who was in charge of the fleet escorting these planes, everything went smoothly until 0300 on the 18th, when our radars began getting blips from what we assumed were picket vessels. These outliers we managed to dodge, but at 0745, another one was sighted, 12,000 yards on our port bow. I directed the Nashville to sink it, but before she succeeded, we intercepted a radio transmission which showed, by its strength, that it was originating close aboard, and our inference was that the picket had given the alarm. Although we were then 650 miles from Tokyo instead of the 400 we had hoped for, the fact that our force had been reported left me no choice. At 0800, I sent Pete Misher a signal, "Launch planes," to Colonel Doolittle and his gallant command. "Good luck and God bless you." The Nitu Maru was the ship that got destroyed, but before it got destroyed by the Americans, it signaled to the mainland. So now, the Doolittle crew had to take off early, take off in the dawn, way before they thought they would. All this meant that they might not even be able to reach China because they had to spend extra fuel to reach Japan because they took off early. On top of this, they would be reaching China at night instead of the next day. So, could they even land at night? Would the airfields be ready in China? These are all questions that we'll have to find out. Remember, we talked about how these planes that were being launched off the aircraft carriers were land-based bombers. So could they even take off correctly? According to Admiral Halsey, the wind and sea were so strong that morning that green water was breaking over the carrier's ramps. Jimmy led his squadron off. When his plane buzzed down the Hornet's deck at 0825, there wasn't a man topside in the task force who didn't help sweat him into the air. One pilot hung on the brink of a stall until we nearly cataloged his effects, but the last of the 16 was airborne by 0924, and a minute later, my staff duty officer was writing in the flag log, "Changed fleet course and access to 090, commencing retirement from the area at 25 knots. So the planes took off, and all of them were headed to Japan. The Doolittle crew did their damage and spent their time blowing up different cities in Japan. According to James A. Doolittle, all pilots were given selected objectives consisting of steelworks, oil refineries, oil tank farms, ammunition dumps, dockyards, munitions plants, airplane factories, etc. They were also given a secondary targets in case it was impossible to reach the primary target. In almost every case, primary targets were bombed. The damage done far exceeded our most optimistic expectations. The high degree of damage resulted from the highly inflammable nature of Japanese construction, the low altitude from which the bombing was carried out, and the perfectly clear weather over Tokyo. So the one benefit of having to take off that early and having to do the bombing earlier was that they were clear targets. Imagine the shock to the Japanese civilian and military as they were looking up into the sky. For the first time since Kublai Khan and the Mongols, the Japanese were being attacked in their own home turf. Unfortunately, due to the fog of war, there were civilian casualties, especially in the planes that bombed Tokyo. 87 civilians were killed and 151 were injured. One of the bombers even shot through a school, thinking it was a factory, killing an elementary school student. The consequences of this raid will be explored in depth later. So now it's time to go to China and try to land the planes. So we mentioned earlier how the raid was supposed to take place at night, but because of various factors, it took place during the day. Well, one of the things that happens when you raid a city during the day is anti-aircraft and planes come in to confront you. So although none of the planes were lost over Tokyo, some of them sustained damage. On top of that, we already mentioned they took off 250 miles before they were supposed to. So most of them were already stretching the fuel. One plane just decided to go straight to Russia. And already we knew at this point that the USSR and Japan had a non-aggression pact. So they were detained. Their plane was confiscated for the rest of the war. But the other 15 planes set course for China. James Doolittle called it good luck. Something unexpected helped the planes reach China. A 25-mile-per-hour tailwind helped all the planes headed towards China for the last 1,200 miles of the trek. Without the tailwind, probably all of the planes, or the majority of them, would have crashed in the ocean. All 16 of the planes did reach China, although none of them reached the airfield that they were aiming for. So they all crash landed. 2 of the planes went missing, and eventually the crew were either killed or captured by the Japanese. The crew of the other 14 planes were now on their way to trying to find the safe areas in China to eventually go back to America. How did they make it to safety? They were helped by local Chinese civilians and military forces. First Lieutenant Richard Joyce recalled after parachuting out of his crashing plane. The next morning it was still foggy, and when it cleared enough for me to see, I started for the wreck of the plane. I had to go over the mountain I was on. I had landed on top of a high mountain on a steep slope with many boulders and cliffs. I realized that I was quite lucky that I was not injured. The plane was only about a mile away, but it took me 4 hours to get to it. When I arrived at the scene of the crash, which was also very high up in the mountain, I found a number of Chinese where they were picking in the wreckage. I hailed them and made them understand that I was an American. They were very friendly towards me. The plane had hit the side of the mountain and sprayed over a large area and had burned. I was able to salvage nothing from it. It was a total loss. The Chinese farmer led me to a small village that day, and the next day I met some Chinese soldiers who held me for a day and then led me over the mountains for 2 days until I reached Tongxi Anhui. And the military police there got me a ride on a truck to Tanqi, and I took the train there from Qinghua to Suzhou. I stayed at Suzhou 3 days, then went to Ningtu. From there, Henyang by bus, which took 3 days, and then a plane picked us up and took us to Chongqing. According to First Lieutenant William Bauer, natives carried us to Xi'an, where a car took us to Suzhou. 6 nights were spent at Army Air Station there, and on Saturday evening we left by train for Yushan. Bus met us, and in this we traveled 3 days to Henyang. A plane met us there and brought us to Chongqing. According to First Lieutenant Edgar McElroy, we were given a nice reception, furnished a nice supper by the sisters of the mission, and put to bed. We stayed in Poyang the next day and night, were well taken care of, and the next morning boarded a steam launch taken all the way to Yingtan. We stayed there that night, were given a banquet the next day by General Liu, and left by train at 2000 for Suzhou. At 0700 the next morning, we left the train because of an air alarm. The engine was machine gunned by 3 planes about 15 minutes later, doing no damage. But we were not allowed to board the train until 1600 o'clock, arriving at Suzhou about 1730 o'clock. We stayed at Suzhou about 3 days. We went by train to Yingtan, 3 days by bus to Henyang, 1 day there, and a plane was sent for us from Chongqing. We arrived in Chongqing on May 3rd. All the Chinese had been very nice to us and did all they could for our comfort. I think what you can get from these 3 accounts, and if you read all the other accounts, is that the Chinese civilians and the Chinese military were very, very helpful towards these Americans. After all, these Americans risked their lives, struck at Japan, a mutual enemy. This Japan that had killed, raped, pillaged, led to millions and millions of casualties in China. There was even a report of a celebration, a parade to honor these Americans. And in response, the Americans gave a lot of these Chinese people that helped them little souvenirs, little gifts, the stuff that weren't lost during their crash landing. Unfortunately, this helpfulness, this kindness, this hospitality that the Chinese showed these Doolittle Raiders would end up hurting them a lot, because the Japanese came back, killed about 250,000 Chinese people in retaliation. How they retaliated was based on what they could find as evidence, and a lot of these souvenirs that the Americans gave the Chinese civilians, the Chinese troops, etc., was used as proof that they helped the Americans.